Hey, hello everyone. This video is going to be a little out of what's typical for this channel, but I've seen a lot of confusion on the internet about tuning a traditional bow, tuning a longbow or a recurve, and so I just wanted to make a short video and kind of clarify a little bit, just some simple ways to tune. Really, when you are tuning a traditional bow, it's different than tuning a compound bow. In a compound bow realm, you typically get a spine that's close and then you tweak and tune the bow to the arrow. In the traditional archery realm, you can't tune the bow. You have to tune the arrow to the bow. And so what you're doing is changing dynamically the stiffness of the arrow so that it comes out of the bow straight. What you want is your arrow coming straight out of the bow, right? Traveling as straight as possible. If it is too weak, it's going to fly like this. If it's too stiff, it's going to fly like this. And so what we want to do is change the stiffness of the arrow so that it doesn't do this and it doesn't do this, but rather it comes out of the bow as straight as possible. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. The simplest way you can do this, and I recommend this for guys who like to gap shoot, who maybe want a particular length arrow. You know, I like to shoot Black Eagle vintages because they're 34 inches long, and if I can keep that arrow as long as possible, it reduces my gaps. And so one good way to tune for arrow length is to simply change point weight. By changing point weight, you can either make the arrow weaker or stiffer. And so you can tune the arrow without having to cut anything at all. Generally, I'd recommend getting online, going to a spine calculator. Three Rivers Archery has an excellent spine calculator. You plug in the information of your bow and what arrow you're using, and it will tell you kind of generally what stiffness is recommended based on your point weight and draw weight and arrow length. All those factors make a difference. So in this case today, I'm going to shoot a full length 400. This is a Black Eagle vintage, and basically what I'm going to just show you is how the point weight can tune the arrow. We're going to start with 250 grain points, and these are 34 inches long. They're uncut shafts, and it's going to be super weak. And as we lower the point weight, you're going to see the arrow get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. And what we're looking for, if the arrow is weak, the bare shaft will impact the target kind of kicked to, if you're looking at the target, it will be kicked to my left. And as it gets stiffer, the back of the arrow will move around. If you're shooting a point weight that's too stiff, the arrow will be angled off to the right when it impacts the target. A lot of guys will tell you, oh, you can't do this in a bag target, you need a particular type of target, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to use a bag target, and you'll be able to see how the point weight affects, and that's the purpose of this video. So that's where we're going to start, is tuning via point weight, and then I'm making up some new arrows, and I'm going to have to do a little bit of cutting. And so when we get to that point, I'll show you how to tune for arrow length by cutting the shaft shorter. When you cut the shaft shorter, you're making it stiffer. And so I have a set of 350s that I anticipate to be just slightly weak at full length, and so I'm going to trim them back, and you'll see how that will stiffen up the arrow as well. But anyway, I hope the video is helpful. I'm going to start off by shooting 250s, 175s, 150s, 125s, 100s, all the way down to 85s, and you'll be able to see how the impact changes as we stiffen the shaft by reducing point weight. If you needed to stiffen, or if you needed to weaken your shaft, I guess, if your shaft was too stiff, you could do the opposite and add point weight until the arrow straightens out. Anyway, watch these impact shots and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, this first shaft is the 250 grain point. Now the 175. $150. $125. Here's a 100. This is an 85. Okay, for comparison's sake, that last one was a Black Eagle Vintage 400 at 34 inches long with a 100 grain point. Seemed to be about where it was right. We're going to shoot a full length Black Eagle Vintage in 350 with a 100 grain point to show you the stiffness difference. See how much stiffer that is? Alright everyone, we're moving on to the second half of the video. In the first half, you saw me show you how to tune a traditional bow like this Black Widow PMA that has no adjustments in the bow itself. You're simply shooting off the shelf by changing point weight in order to alter the dynamic spine of the arrow to get the arrows tuned and flying correctly when you're shooting a bare shaft. Now that method works very well, and it's simple and it's cheap. But there are some drawbacks. If you're looking to shoot a particular point weight or have a particular front of center weight, that method is not going to work because you basically are stuck with whatever weight makes the arrow fly correctly. And that may be heavier than you'd like, and it may be lighter than you like. I would like to go with a 150 or a 200 grain point, and that arrow tuned out at 100 grains. So I knew we were going to have to make some changes. So I bought a 350 spine, which is much stiffer, and I thought if I shoot this full length, keep it very weak dynamically that way, and also add 200 or 250 grains, I'd probably be in the ballpark. Well, I tried that, and even with 250 grains up front, that 350 spine out of my 49-pound Black Widow PMA was too weak. So the next option, in order to run heavier weight, is to bare shaft tune the arrow by cutting it shorter. Now, you could only use this method to tune if your arrow needs to be stiffer, because if it needed to be weaker, you would need to add length to the arrow, and obviously you can't do that. So at 34 inches, and in a Black Eagle Vintage, that's carbon to carbon, so once you add the knock on, it winds up being 34 1/4. At 34 1/4, with 100 grains up front, the arrow was flying well. But I want 150. So we are going to show you in the second half of this video how to tune a traditional bow by cutting the arrow shaft shorter. Now, with 150 up front, you'll show this. I'm going to walk you through the series of shots. You'll see that it's weak. And I'm going to begin by cutting a 1/2 inch off the shaft. And I'll do that a couple of times. But as I get closer, we're going to cut in smaller increments. We're going to make a couple cuts a 1/4 inch at a time, and then go down to an 1/8 of an inch at a time. Because like I said, you can't add arrow length. So better to cut multiple times than to cut too much and be stuck. So this second half of the video, we're going to show you how to do that. And hopefully we'll get an arrow that's flying well out of the bow without any feathers on it, and then when we put feathers on it, we will have a very well tuned arrow that's flying hopefully like a dart out of this Black Widow. So tune in for the second half of the video here. Okay, here we go. Our first arrow is the Black Eagle Vintage 400, 34 inches long with a 150 grain point. I'm shooting directly over top of the camera into the target. So, this arrow's knock high and it's weak because the back end is angled off to the left. So that's going to be our baseline, and from there we will cut about a 1/2 inch down and see where it's at. So here I am at the workbench. The easiest way to bare shaft tune, and when you're cutting the arrow, is to cut it from the insert, or rather from the knock end. You just pop the knock out, take a 1/2 inch off the shaft, pop the knock back in. Then you don't got to worry about using the isopropyl alcohol and cleaning it and, you know, re-gluing inserts in and all that. So pop the knock off. We're going to cut the 1/2 inch off, and we'll show you what it flies like. Okay, so here we are. The shaft's a 1/2 inch shorter. See how it flies. still weak, though it looks a little better. I'll take a couple more just to verify that. We'll take another 1/2 inch off. Okay, so I cut another 1/2 inch off, so now we are 1 inch shorter than what we started with, and let's see how it flies. So you can see there it's a little bit straighter. I know it's going to be knock high, but we're getting closer. I'm going to start cutting down in 1/4 inch increments now and see if we can get that thing totally straight. Okay, so we took that 1/4 inch off. Now we're 1 1/4 inches shorter than where we started. Still weak and knock high. Okay, I took another 1/4 inch off, so now we're 1 1/2 inches shorter than where we started. I can tell that's flying better. So I took an 1/8 off that time because we're getting close. So we're 1 5/8 inches shorter. Flying a lot better, might be just a smidge weak. I'll take a few more, maybe I'll take another 1/8. The cresting, and I've got some electrical tape on there to try to make up some of the weight, but the cresting and the vanes will add some weight to the back and stiffen it up some, so it's alright if it's slightly weak. So I took off one more 1/8. We're now 1 3/4 inches shorter than where we started. That was really good flight. I think we're probably going to stay right there, and I'll do a wrap up and talk a little bit, but I think that'll do it. Okay, so that's our tuning process. I just wanted to give you kind of a brief recap of where we wound up. We started with that Black Eagle vintage at 34 1/4 inches long. We began to cut to make the arrow stiffer, and we wound up with an overall length from the throat of the nock to the end of the arrow of 32 1/2 inches in order to shoot that 150 grains. Now, if I wanted to go to 200 or 250 grains, I could use this same arrow and I would just cut it shorter to get more FOC. So keep that in mind. I wanted to start with the 150, see how I like it, and if I want to go higher, I can always cut more off. So here's what we wound up with. Here is the Black Eagle. A couple things I wanted to point out to you. I ran, let me come in here a little bit closer and show it to you. I ran a 100 grain field point with an insert, and then I screwed in a 50 grain brass weight behind it. So this is a 15 grain insert. It's 165 grains up front altogether. I was curious if the arrow would shoot any different with the 150 grains being made up of the screw-in weight and the point rather than just a 150 grain field point. So I shot them side by side and saw virtually no difference whatsoever. So keep that in mind. Another thing I wanted to point out to you that I noticed in my tuning that you may run across as well, I had the bare shafts flying right down the middle. I fletched these up and I was consistently getting some right impacts once I put feathers on them, which made no sense at all. So I started looking in the Black Widow tuning manual and digging around a little bit, and ultimately discovered that probably what was happening was one of the quills on the feather where they attach right to the arrow was probably impacting off the shelf here in a unique manner, causing the arrows to impact right. So what I wound up doing was taking all of the arrows and ultimately turning the nock and getting the arrows positioned, and I was able to watch the arrow impact move from being right at target to being right where I was looking by rotating the feathers downward. And so once I figured that out, I got them all adjusted the same way, and they're flying fantastic out of this bow. So those are just a couple small pointers that I hope are helpful to you. That's my video on tuning a traditional bow using point weight or by cutting the arrow shoulder order. I hope it's helpful to you. If you have any questions, shoot them below. Tuning often comes with a lot of complex factors, but I hope this gets you started in the right direction. Don't be afraid to play around with things, especially when you're doing the weight tuning method, because you can't really screw anything up. Anyway, good luck this season, and I hope you have success with your traditional bow.